See, normally I do this stuff while I'm walking up and Roberta's praying. Let's go this way. Let's go. There we go. There's what I'm looking for. All right. So 1 Corinthians is coming. Caleb, you don't have for having problems, man. Okay. Don't mind me. You guys keep yourself occupied. We bought a new tablet to fix our problems. We have a problem. Sound booth, we have a problem. Okay, there we go. So, nothing to see here. All right, I think I'm ready to start a Bible study, except for I'm not in 1 Corinthians 9. There we go. We're actually going to do verses 19 through the end, verse 27. But you know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to back us up to chapter 8. And I want to read these first 3 verses because for the note takers and just for all of us, it's good to know that chapters 8, 9, and 10 are all in response to one question that the Corinthians had. So really, these 3 chapters all go together as a single response, but he hits a lot of important kind of rabbit trails and things in the middle. So, I mean, we could easily do 6 Sunday morning sermons or more on these 3 chapters, but it is also one overarching response. So to kick it off, it says in chapter 8, verse 1, now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we have all knowledge, and knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, this one is known by him. That sets a tone for these 3 chapters. They had an issue with idols and meats, and in short, basically there was an issue where some people were convicted about a certain sin, or not even a sin, it was just what we're allowed to do, what we're not. Are Christians allowed to watch rated R movies? Are Christians allowed to dance? Are Christians allowed to... I mean, there's some of these issues that over the years, people have been a little divided over. And some people feel like, no, we shouldn't do that. And other people feel like, no, that there shouldn't be a problem. And in Corinth, there was fighting over it. And Paul is then encouraging people to remember that knowledge, doctrinally, the Bible doesn't talk about dancing, but getting into some nerdy theological thing versus love. Love is what matters, is what Paul says. And so these 3 chapters is really him expounding on that whole thought. 1 Corinthians 13, we get some foreshadowing here. Many of us know as the love chapter. In fact, I'll just flip over and read a few of those famous verses. 1 Corinthians 13:4, love suffers long and is kind, does not envy, does not parade itself, does not behave rudely, right? Bears all things. Verse 7, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. Verse 8. And this is the agape love. It is confusing a little bit because phileo love and agape love are both translated love in the New Testament. And as we read in English, we get one word, and you don't always know which one they're talking about, but one's a brotherly love, phileo love. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. But agape love is sacrificial in nature. And so in chapter 9, verses 19 to 27, is where we're going to be learning about this sacrificial love. I want to walk through the verses to just explain them, and then I want to wrap back around, and then we'll just start really looking at this sacrificial kind of love, living a life of sacrifice and sacrificial love. So let's look at verse 19 in 1 Corinthians 9. And it says, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. And to those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you. Hitting this first chunk first, he's talking about how he's laying down his rights, and he's laying it all down. And that's where really, again, chapter 8, going into the beginning of chapter 9, Paul talks about how he lays down his rights in order to win people to Christ, to win people the gospel. He's laying down things, and the whole first part of chapter 9, he talks all about his rights, and he basically lays out a whole case. This is my right. Here's why it's my right. Here's Bible verses why it's my right. And it's my right. It's my right. It's my right. But I lay it down, trying to make the point, like, I know it's my right. I can argue it's my right, but now I'm going to tell you why I'm laying my rights down, so that I might win people. In fact, if you don't have it highlighted, you should highlight it. If your neighbor's not highlighting it, you can highlight it for them if you want. In verse 22, I become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. It's a good verse to sit and chew on, to think, yes, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. And if you look at the things he talks about, he gives specific examples. And it helps paint a picture of who Paul was. Because he says, I'm free, but I'm going to be a servant. Notice in verse 20, I find this fascinating and instructive. He says, to the Jews I became as a Jew. Paul's as Jewish as a Jew can be, right? I mean, this guy, you go into Philippians, right? He talks about his Jewish pedigree in Philippians 3. He starts talking about like, man, I'm as Jewish as a Jew comes. I mean, concerning the law, I was perfect. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He laid down, he's like, I'm as Jewish as Jews get. He goes, what this obviously shows, though, is at this point in his life, he obviously wasn't living like a Jew. It's a little eye-opener we're thinking of, but he doesn't have to become as a Jew if he was living in such a way that he was indistinguishable from the Jews. He was probably living in the freedom in Christ that he now found. It also says to those under the law, and it's being even more specific, maybe a proselyte, someone who wasn't born Jewish but became a Jew and was practicing the Jewish law. Paul wasn't practicing all of the Jewish law at this point. You actually find out in Galatians about how when some of the disciples who were very Jewish, you might say, they followed the Jewish customs really strictly. When they went from Jerusalem up to Antioch, Paul talks about how he had to call out Peter. Because I'm going to maybe embellish the story a little bit, but Peter's enjoying a ham sandwich in one hand. He's got a bratwurst in the other. He's enjoying, he's got cheese on his meat. He's having a great old time. But then when he saw those guys show up, he sweeps them under the table, and he starts following Jewish law because he didn't want them to think less. And Paul calls him out. He's like, dude, you don't live that way anymore. Don't pretend like you're still following the law like we used to. You don't. So don't put on a show for these guys. And there was a contention there. And so Paul wasn't living by the law. He wasn't living as a Jew. Now, he still did a lot of Jewish traditions and customs. You find him going to the temple, and that early church, because they were raised Jewish, they would still show up at the hour of prayer. They would still do some Jewish things, but he made it real clear. But when I was with Jews, I would be like a Jew so that I could win them over. Me sitting there eating the ham in front of them probably wouldn't do so well, right? But at this point, he said to become as the law. So even just kind of going further. And then in verse 21, to those who are without the law, as without the law. Now, I've been joking about bacon and ham and bratwurst, but truth be told, I actually don't know how much pork those guys would have eaten, because when you're raised your whole life, right, being told that something is dirty and unclean, it'd probably be actually a hard transition. But I wouldn't be surprised if when hanging out with Gentiles and pork was set before him, I'm just going to go on, I'm just guessing. I don't think Paul ordered pork from the deli. But I bet you if the Gentiles said it before him, I'm going to eat this. In fact, in the Didache, one of the early church writings we have outside of the Bible, it talks about how you can tell a true apostle and prophet from a false one if they refuse the food that's set before them. If they start requesting special dining requests, he's like, that's a false prophet. They'll eat what you put before them. It's the same with a missionary today, and I know a lot of missionaries, right? What they eat on the mission field is not what they order when they come back to the States, right? You go down to South America, you eat gerbil, and you're happy you're getting gerbil and pig meat. Or I think you got, all the guinea pig. There we go, guinea pig, right? It's like, yeah, I'm eating guinea pig because they're giving me guinea pig. But that's what he's saying is, when I was with people without the law, I was like someone who was without the law. These guys are being a little different, and I'm kind of laying back, and I find myself do the same thing where it's like, you hear people acting a certain way, and Christians would never act that way, but they're not Christians. And we talked about this a few weeks ago where it's like, my job isn't to get non-Christians to follow Christian morals. I'm trying to get unbelievers saved. So I'm not going to sit there and nitpick all the things they do, how they do it. That guy just said a curse word. I better rebuke him for saying a bad word. It's like, you know what? He's got an unregenerate soul. I just need to close my mouth, stick it out, and smile and nod, and then try and win these people over to the Lord. And in verse 22, to the weak I became as weak. And I believe that would probably be a reference back in chapter 8 and chapter 10. Chapter 8 starts with meat. Chapter 10 ends with meat. And he talks about he who is, and in Romans, between the two books, where he had to answer similar questions, to him who is weak, he only eats vegetables. He doesn't eat meat. And Paul's making the point because people had these non-biblical convictions about meat eating. But Paul said, but if I'm around them, in fact, the last verse of chapter 8, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat again. I'll never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So that's his mentality. I'll do anything to win someone over. And then he kind of takes it to the next level. Verses 24 to 27. He says, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So, I have referred to this text numerous times over the years. It's a great little text talking about really going hard for Jesus, doing what it takes. Now, in the context of our book of 1 Corinthians, in this 3-chapter section, what he really was talking about is putting himself into subjection in order to be all things to all men. And he realizes it takes a lot of self-control to be all things to all men. You ever meet people? It's an effortful thing to be nice around them, right? It's an effortful thing to be kind. That's your car. You're in trouble. Honking during church is not appropriate. All right. So here's the thing now. He starts talking about sports, and I'll tell you what. The Romans, the Corinthians, all of them, they were avid sports fans. So much so, I would say they would probably beat, the Seahawks fans at the CenturyLink Stadium. I mean, these guys it was huge. Sports were huge. And I want to make reference. I don't know if my tablet's going to work at all today. I'm just going to go like this. Plan B. It's not really working. You think it's working. I know it's up there, but it didn't work. When I tried to put it up there, then it didn't work. So if I go like this, I might actually get it to come up there when I want it to go up there at the right time. Maybe, maybe not. All that said, so the Panhellenic Games, now everyone's heard of the Olympics. That's like the easy stuff, right? But there were 4 major athletic games in the olden days of ancient Greece. And the Olympics were held every 4 years. Now, the Isthmian Games are at Corinth, the isthmus, that little skinny part we talked about where Corinth was located. They were held every 2 years. The second and fourth year, they were in the spring. The Nepean Games were in the fall. And there's the Pythian Games every 3rd year. So basically, every year, there would be athletics going on. And from what I read, the Olympics were the most important of all the games. They were dedicated to Zeus. The games at Corinth, the Isthmian Games, were actually the second most popular, and they were dedicated to Poseidon, the god of the sea. And they were right there. It was a big shipping area. Everything was dedicated to Poseidon. And at these games, there was running. See, I clicked it. Did it work? See, I told everyone, it's working now. It's not working. People who are going to listen to a recording of this at a later date, they're going to be so confused. All right, but running the race. In verse 24, do you not know who those who run in a race all run? The word there is stadion. It's a 600-foot, 185-meter foot race. And this was the standard race that started off all the Olympic Games. And so Paul's word he uses there is the word for this Olympic race. On top of that, we've got chariot races. I think they're going to be clicking for me from here on out. From here on out, you click, not me. Chariot races. We got chariot. Actually, I probably have to leave. I'm lost. You see a chariot? Well, holy smokes, look at that. Okay. This is going to be a fun Sunday. Thankfully, anyway. Chariot races was the prime event, actually, at Corinth, because chariot races were dedicated to Poseidon. He was the main guy of that event, etc., etc. We also have wrestling. Now, wrestling, which will be up in like 10 minutes when my tablet connects with it, whatever it's talking to. Wrestling was a 3-point event. You would knock someone out of bounds for a point, get them to touch the ground for a point, and submission was a point. And obviously, we still have wrestling around today. We've also got boxing. And so the Greek boxing was just like boxing. They would just punch. Punch. And then last but not least, whether you have a picture or not, is the pankration. Now, pankration is what we would call mixed martial arts today. So there was wrestling, no striking. There was boxing, no wrestling. Then there was the pankration, which was anything goes. There's 2 classes, boys and men. I actually didn't quite figure out where the age break was, but basically there's no weight classes. There was boys and men. The only rules was no biting and no eye gouges unless the games were being held at Sparta, where everything goes. This is history. I love it. So the pankration, they would wrestle, they'd fight, they do all their things. Now, I did look up one guy, famous Corinthian. Well, actually, he's Thebes. He's from Thebes. But Kleitomachos, very macho. He won boxing, wrestling, and the pankration all in the same year at Corinth. Made him very, very famous. But all this stuff said, Paul often referred to sports. And these sporting events he talked about, everyone knew how they worked. To enter the Olympics or the Isthmian Games or any of them, you had to have documentation of your training 10 months leading up to the event. It's funny because they obviously didn't do drug testing, so I didn't know exactly what they were looking for. But what it really seemed to be is that they didn't want anyone just entering who was a nobody. Like, if you were going to enter, you had to prove you were committed to this show that was going to be put on. 10 months of training. Then you had to show up at the event 1 month early where all the competitors trained at the gymnasium there at the place where it was going to be held, Corinth for our example. And for that month, you're being watched as you trained. It's interesting is that Kleitomachos guy, ancient histories talking about him, that he was so rigid in his training. And actually one of the things they even mentioned was abstinence. He's like, yep, I wouldn't even look at an impure thing leading up months before the event because he kept his mind pure and his body pure, and he was a crazy athlete. This is the background, though, of what Paul is thinking of. Paul grew up in Tarsus, and they had games in Tarsus. They weren't the Greek games, but when Rome spread, the games spread elsewhere, and a Jew wasn't allowed to compete in them. But he's a competitive-sounding guy. You read his writings, and he talks about boxing and running and fighting and training and throughout his epistles. So Paul was probably a sports fan. So if you're a sports fan, call it a godly, thing. At least you can feel good, right? Like, yeah, Paul was a sports fan, therefore I am a sports fan. But this is the picture that's being painted here, all right? This picture of being sacrificial in what you're doing. And so I'm giving up on putting any slides up on the board at all. So that's okay. You guys can listen to me. Back in the day, children, there used to be churches without screens. This is just a fact, okay? I'm just going to throw that out there. So I want to talk, though, about this stuff. I had the things up there so you could see the titles. You live without them. But living sacrificially, that's what this whole section is about. And I want to start by going with, what do we sacrifice? Oh, look at these guys catch up on me. And it's everything. It's the idea of when you look at verses 19 to 23, there was nothing that wasn't on the table for Paul. He talks about everything's on the table as a possibility to be sacrificed. And I think Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, and we'll see if they're on their on game. No, maybe, we'll find out. This is so fun. Philippians chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. But what things were gained to me, these things I have counted loss for Christ. Yet indeed I also count all things loss for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus, oh, look, you got it all up there. My Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish that I may gain Christ. And our word rubbish there means poo-poo. I'm just throwing that back out for you. And then he goes, that I may be found in him. Verse 10, that I may know him. So Philippians 3, it's actually right after he gave that pedigree. I'm a Pharisee of the tribe of Benjamin. I've done all this. He goes, but everything was just caca. That's the Greek. Everything was just poo in comparison to the knowledge of Jesus Christ, to being nearer to him, to being obedient to him. Nothing mattered. And so this is why when we see in these verses, I became all things to all men. I had no rights. Yeah, I have rights, but not one right was ever exercised if it got between me and someone's receiving the gospel. Nothing mattered other than them receiving the gospel. And so we see this as, I'm willing to give it all up. And so what we sacrifice was real simple. He says, I sacrifice everything. Nothing is too precious. How do we sacrifice? And I think the simple way to put it is with all diligence. We see that in the next section, right? Verses 24 to 27. The whole point he makes, don't you realize that when people are running a race, they know that there's only going to be one winner. You don't go out there just jogging. You run like there's a prize at the end of the race, and only one person's going to get that prize. And so it talks about in verse 25, he who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Okay? They're willing to be temperate in everything because they see the prize at the end of the race. Some of you may recall, in 2012, I won this diet and exercise kind of competition. There was a prize, $10,000. I trained and I competed for 12 weeks in this thing. Like there was 10 grand waiting for me at the end. And after 12 weeks, I found out that I won. And you know what? It made it worth weighing food by the gram on a digital scale and all the weird junk I had to do because I realized, like, I'm going to win this. Like, you know what? I'm going to win this thing. And I went into it with the mentality, I'm going to win this thing. And I'm like, and everything I was doing for 12 weeks, not everything I was doing. I had church, I had work, I had everything. But it was like rigorous, keeping track of everything, writing things down, weighing food out. It was ridiculous. But guess what? My assumption is that like the 5, 6, however many thousand people who didn't win, they might not have been doing that. But that was just an example personally because you know what the thing is? Anyone here has been around long enough, 10 grand sounds great, but it perishes pretty quick, doesn't it? The government took 3.5 of that away real fast. My high school students, are you going to retire? I was asked that. Some of the people here were in my classes in 2012, so you guys should just stare at the ground. No, but I remember it was my GEMS group. They're, are you going to retire, mister? I was like, yeah, I'm going to buy a Ferrari and then retire with my 10 grand. You can tell who's worked a job and who hasn't in this world. But the point is putting your body into subjection, temperate in all things. That was the idea. How do we sacrifice? It's with diligence. It's effortful. I'm not going to just kind of fall into Christian maturity. I'm not just going to accidentally stumble into living a lifestyle that would not offend and push away people that I want to be winning to Christ. It's a very effortful thing where things are measured and calculated and weighed out. And it's in all things, he says. He's temperate in all things. And this is the push, that I live a life where I could sacrifice everything. And then the kind of big thing is the why do we sacrifice? Okay, why are we doing this? And I've got 3 reasons why we sacrifice. What is the purpose of all this then? Number 1 is we live sacrificially for God because it's reasonable to. So we're doing it for God. That's number one. It should always stay number one. But look at Romans 12:1, right? I beseech you there, I'm begging you, brethren. He's talking to Christians, right? By the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Paul writing to Christians, it's by the mercies of God. It's not a work of the flesh. It's you leaning on him. But presenting yourself as a living sacrifice, a daily, ever-burning sacrifice on that altar. And he puts it there, that it's your reasonable service. And I think if you've received the gospel, then you should understand why it's your reasonable service. And if you don't understand why it's your reasonable service, you maybe need to go back and reevaluate and understand that the cost paid at Calvary is something that if we tried our best, we could never pay back. And so when God asks for a little thing, he's not asking for us to buy it. He's just saying, is it not reasonable? Let me throw out a scenario for you. You're sick and you're in the hospital and you're on your deathbed. Now there's an experimental process that could be done, a new treatment, but you can't afford the treatment. Insurance isn't going to pay for an experimental thing. And someone comes, your friend, I'll pay for it. I'm going to pay $1 million for their experimental treatment. And when you get out of the hospital, you're alive and you're well. And you find out while you're in there, they also paid off your car and your home. And they bought you some new furniture. They didn't just save you from death, but they blessed you beyond comprehension. And one day you bump into them at the store, and they're there at the register, and they're trying to buy the loaf of bread and the gallon of milk and the block of cheese, and they realize they don't have any money, and could you cover this for me? And you're like, duh. Like, of course I can cover that for you. Like, you saved my life, you gave me a house, you gave me all these things. It's super reasonable, isn't it? To just pay back a little bit, to try and whatever you want, man. Like, I'll do whatever you ask me to do. It's beyond reasonable that you would take everything from me. It's that realization to sacrifice all, it's reasonable if you understand what was sacrificed for you. When we realize what was given for us, giving in return, it's not a burden. It's not a hardship. It's totally reasonable. Secondly, we sacrifice and live sacrificially for the lost because they're worth it. Truthfully, most of the things that Paul was being asked to sacrifice, their rights, privileges, pleasantries. And it's sad but true that you and I are guilty of probably ruining witness opportunities, hindering our testimonies and all these things because quite often we cling to our rights, our privileges, and our pleasantries. In chapter 10, verse 33, they can put it up. It's right here on the page too, right next to it. Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Again, back in verse 22 of chapter 9, I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And that's the whole thing he realizes, that lost souls have a big value. And you know, it might not seem the same until it's your beloved lost soul. Maybe not yours personal, but as in your child, your sibling, your spouse, your parent. And when you know the people you've longed for, and all of us have to have at least one, if not dozens, people we know we want to see saved, and we know they're not saved, and we would give anything for them to be saved. And it's like, well, tell me, to see that person you love so much get saved, is it worth someone else sacrificing some TV? Sacrificing longer hours at work? Sacrificing just the right to behave a certain way? Because again, I could biblically argue my rights, but at the end of the day, All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. That's chapter 10, verse 23. It's all, again, those 3 chapters, they all kind of come together. So it's hard to just teach one part without pulling from those other 2 chapters. But that's the idea. It's like, well, I could defend my right to do these things. Do you want me to defend your right to do this and do that? Oh, yeah, sure, Christians can do those things. But is it going to be edifying to the weak brother, to the baby Christian, to the unbeliever? And so realizing I do it because I realize that their maturity and their salvation is worth me sacrificing some of the things that I have the right to do. Last but not least, we sacrifice for a prize. We live sacrificially because there's actually a prize at the end of the tunnel. There's something waiting for us at the end. I want to talk about 5 crowns. The Bible mentions 5 different crowns specifically. And so this will be the kind of closing thing is talking about these, because this is cool stuff. And I'm going to throw out there for you guys, this isn't something that there is a definitive right answer. But with a little bit of study, I think you can understand what these 5 crowns are that get mentioned. And they get mentioned very distinctly in the Bible, in the New Testament. And so I just want to look at them to understand there's prizes in heaven. We don't know what they all look like. And there's probably more than 5. But these 5 we've heard of. And the first one is here in verses 24, 25. It is the imperishable crown. So in verse 25, right, it says, everyone who competes for a prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore, I run thus, right? I discipline my body in verse 27. I bring in a subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I should become disqualified. I think the imperishable crown is a reward for discipline in this life, for living a disciplined, temperate life. I think he's describing something where not every Christian going to heaven is going to live with discipline. Not every person's going to go into heaven who chose to sacrifice and live a rigid life, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because they realized much good would come from it. And they knew that they would never be God would never be their debtor. You're not going to get to heaven and be like, look at all I did. Because when you see what awaits you there, you'll realize, no, I don't deserve this. I didn't do that much. No, that's the thing is God is not a debtor. He's a great blesser. The next crown that we will see is the crown of rejoicing. The crown of rejoicing, found in 2 places, 1 Thessalonians 2:19, Philippians 4:1. So in our first verse, we see, for what is our hope or our joy or our crown of rejoicing? Is it not even you are in the presence of our Lord Jesus Christ at his coming? And grammatically there, so Paul is telling the Thessalonians, what is our crown of rejoicing? Isn't it you? And it talks about them being in the presence of the Lord Jesus. Somehow them being in his presence is their crown. In Philippians 4:1, we see, therefore, my beloved and longed for brethren, and he calls them my joy and my crown. It seems that this crown of rejoicing is a result or a reward for souls saved. He talks to the Thessalonians, you being at his appearing, that's going to be my crown. The Philippians, you, my brethren, the church that he planted, where he got started, you're my crown. Now, is it going to be a physical crown, right? We don't know all. We know there's going to be some ring toss going on at the feet of Jesus with crowns up in heaven. We see that in Revelation. But the point is that there's a reward specifically, I believe, for saving lost souls. That every single time you are used by God to help lead someone to the Lord, there will be reward awaiting you. Thirdly, we see the crown of glory mentioned in 1 Peter 5:4. Now, reading verses 2-4 for a little bit of context, Peter is saying, shepherd the flock of God which is among you. He's talking to elders and leaders in the church. He tells these leaders, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly, not as being lords over those entrusted to you, but by being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. I believe that there is a reward for those who lead in the church. I believe those who step into this is not just a pastor-only type leadership, but to those who are leading in the church, taking on the responsibility of overseeing others, I believe that there is a crown and a reward for that. Next is, I believe, the crown of life. Yes, the crown of life. Revelation 2:10, James 1:12. I'll toss out both of these verses like as an example. You could think, are these just obscure references? One thing we learn about in our Greek language is that the word the crown of life, they didn't have to use it in Greek. The word the was an optional word. If they use the, it's usually because you're speaking of something very specific. So they could say crown of life and move on, and just talk about a generic crown of life. But when you say the crown of life, it's talking about something specific. So again, we have it in both places, Revelation 2:10, James 1:12. Revelation 2:10, do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. This is to the church of Smyrna in his letter at the beginning of Revelation, in Jesus' letter. But he says, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, Revelation 2:10 alone would maybe make us think that this is a crown only for martyrs. I do think martyrs get this. You're martyred and killed for your faith, special reward. But James 1:12 also says, blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. I'm just going to toss in John 14:15 there. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. There's a tie there with love and obedience, right? So what I'm now thinking is this crown of life is obedience in the face of great temptation, great persecution, even unto death. And that's the idea. So brother or sister, let's just put it this way. You're feeling tempted. It's addiction, it's lust, it's greed, it's whatever. It seems as if the crown of life is on the table. That there's a reward when you have been faced with great temptation and you remain obedient in spite of Satan's desire to tempt us. He goes, there's a reward for that. You're not just doing it for nothing. You're not just hanging in there and holding on and saying no when everything else in your body wants to say yes. He goes, there's a reward for that. And last but not least, the crown of righteousness. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8. And I'm just going to flip over there because it's worth flipping there. Paul's swan song, the final chapter of his final book. And it plays so perfectly into our 1 Corinthians text. Paul says, for I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. Pause right there just to say, if you're unfamiliar, Paul was on death row. He was expecting his beheading any day now. So this is the context of him writing these final verses of his final letter. And he says, I'm already being poured out. My time of my departure is at hand. Verse 7. But I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Years earlier, he wrote 1 Corinthians saying, this is my job. I want to fight the fight. I want to run the race. I don't want to just play church. I want to be a Christian. I want to do this thing. And now here he is facing death. And with confidence, Paul says, I did it. And in verse 8, finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but to all who have loved his appearing. This is the only place the crown of righteousness is mentioned, which makes it harder to pinned down, for me to just tell you, this is how you get it. But if I gave you my gut, and just from reading the scriptures, I feel like it's a crown for finishing well. Because many Christians don't finish well. Once you're in, you're in. But many don't finish well. And there are many who have become pastors and great popular teachers who've then fallen and become disqualified. Some rebound to whatever extent. Others just fade away. Some people start strong and they finish horrible. I think there is a special reward for hanging on all the way to the end and finishing the race that you start. Once again, you're going to enter into his presence. No more sorrow, no more tears. He'll wipe away the tears of any regrets you might have, and you'll enter into the joy of your Lord. But Matthew 25, 23, words we all should be familiar with. His Lord said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord." So I think there's a crown for finishing well. It doesn't mean you've got to finish like this guy's finishing well, or you've got to finish like that lady's finishing well. But whatever race he's put you in, will you finish well what he's put you in charge of, what he has entrusted to you? That's the important thing, is that finishing well. And so we have these 5 crowns. They're promised to the church. And it's something we're all going to face. You see, Christians have no option of being spectators. There is no such thing as a Christian spectator sport. There is a game going on in an arena. There are those outside and there are those inside. The ones inside, you might be warm in a bench seat, but you have a suit and you are intended to play. I skipped it earlier for my beloved slide guides, but in 2 Corinthians 5:10, it tells us, we, speaking to Corinth again in the second letter, we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body, according to whatever he's done, whether good or bad. This is a promise for Christians. The judgment seat, the bema seat. And it's, again, at a game like the Olympics, this is the seat that the judges sat in. This isn't the white throne where the judge throws you in jail. This is the judgment of your performance. And we'll all be judged. I've got at least a minute or two. I can add a story I wasn't sure if I was going to tell or not. I didn't write it down or anything, so I'm going to butcher names or whatnot. But if there's one thing people like talking about less than giving, it's the New England Patriots. But, oh good, I got laughs. Okay, but the thing is, though, is I was looking this up. I was curious because I just want to encourage all of us here. Some of us don't feel like quarterbacks, right? I mean, like, I'm a Christian, but like, maybe I'm a blocker. But some of us say, like, I barely do anything in this team. Like, I hardly play. And so I want to go look some statistics up. In Super Bowl 36, the Patriots' first Super Bowl win, 7 seconds left in the game, and the kicker comes in for the win. 2 years later, he does the same thing. He's the only person, I forgot his name. Some of you real big sports guys might even know his name. But he's the only guy in NFL history that has like 2 game-winning plays for Super Bowls like under his belt. But it is. Here they are, tied at 17-17 with less than 2 minutes left. They get the ball. Tom Brady's like, almost a rookie at that point. I mean, he's going forward and he's doing his thing, and they drive down the field, kicks a 48-yard field goal with 7 seconds left in the game. Now, kickers don't play very much, do they? I'm just saying that they're not on the field often. But what do you see them doing on the sideline? They're there just kicking into a net. They're just practicing. They're just doing their thing so that when the time comes, that they would be called on to get their job done, the one that they were created and designed for. A lot is on the line. And I think that's the part where when we get to 1 Corinthians 12, every one of us has a calling from God of how we fit in the body of Christ. And even body parts, some of them aren't doing stuff all the time, but they're important. And when you need them, you need them. And all of us know that there are body parts that you didn't know existed until you got a little older and they started hurting. And you're like, I didn't care about this random thing until now it doesn't work. Now that it doesn't work, I know that body part by name. Because when it's hurting, I'm hurting. And when the body is all working and all the parts are functioning, amazing stuff takes place. Huge things happen. You got my little one-liners that I came up with? I like this. Winners are willing to trade the good for the better. But champions trade the better for the best. And as we live this life, we are going to be faced with many, many, many good things. Things that are not wrong, not bad, not unlawful. And yet, if God would give us that vision of heaven, the vision of what is at stake, the value of our lost loved ones, and remembering that you might not be the one to save your lost loved one, but you might be the one who saves someone else's. More often, that is the case. Someone else is going to save your lost loved one, and you're supposed to save their lost loved one. As we go and we realize what's at stake, and we realize I can trade off some good things in this life for something that's better. And I'm even willing to trade off the better things if I realize that the best is on the line, the possibility for great things. Leonard Ravenhill, one of my favorite authors, and one of my favorite quotes of his: who will deny himself good food, good company, or good rest, that hell may gaze upon him wrestling, embarrassing demons, liberating captives, and in answer to his travail, a stream of blood-washed souls. Prayer is probably one of the most taxing things to truly do, to sit and spend that time praying to the invisible God in faith that he can do a miraculous thing, to committing that time to pray for people and stay faithful doing it. It's one thing to show up at the gym each week. It's another thing to show up to the closet and just continue faithfully sacrificing, knowing that it's worth it and that it has an effect. Anyone who's ever been on a diet knows it doesn't happen quickly, but faithfulness over a long period of time can produce amazing results. And so I pray that we would be faithful and that be willing to sacrifice whatever it may be that God calls us to, because a lot is on the line. Let's pray.